Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And returning to us today is Dr. Andrew Hartman, author of Education in the Cold War, The War for the Soul of America, A History of the Culture Wars, Intellectual Labyrinth, Intellectual History for Complicated Times, where he was a co-editor, and most importantly for us, Marx in America, or Karl Marx in America. I forgot the good old Karl. Which is a history of exactly what it sounds like it's about. Marx's writings in the United States, which are extensive, believe it or not, even though they were not primarily in English. Dr. Hartman is a professor of history at Illinois State University, and you write on cultural, intellectual, and political history. We are co-members of an intellectual society, of which I am a non-historian member, which is kind of funny. Society for Intellectual Historians, of which I am not really a historian, but write on intellectual history related stuff, so I'm a member. So there's my bias. And while there have been some recent works on, I'm thinking of the work of Spencer Leonard, on Marx's American journalism because it's underread. You are pretty much writing one of the more accessible books on what Marx was up to in writing for publications in the United States, which has been much more extensive than I realized. I was going through some Hal Draper notes, and I found all this stuff where he was commenting on Marxist encyclopedia entries, particularly a pretty bitter one he wrote on Simon Bolivar. But and they were all written for a publication in the United States, and it just reminded me that this has been sort of blocked out of history. Your book is coming out from University of Chicago Press, right?
Yes.
Is it out now, or is it coming out? I can't remember.
No, it's out in May 2025, so a few more months.
This will literally be coming out right when it comes out, so we timed it perfectly for once. Awesome. So let's talk about it. Why did Marx write so much for publications in the United States, a place that he didn't always understand super well and that he didn't ever visit?
That's a good question, yeah. And that's like Marx's writings about the U.S. and his correspondence with people in the U.S. Form chapter 1 of the book. So he was, to begin with, like many European writers in the 19th century, fascinated by the United States. It just was different enough from anything he was seeing in Europe that it allowed him to sort of expand his imagination when it came to thinking about the big questions related to capitalism, democracy. And so, like, for example, he had read from various travel logs about the Working Men's Party and about sort of what at that time was the most mass democracy, and thought, well, maybe, just maybe, the US is the place where the working class, because they have the right to vote, at least some of them, will usher in socialism from below. And so this fascinated him, while at the same time, the more he learned about the US, especially after 1848, when the failed revolutions in Europe led to many of his friends and comrades emigrating to the United States, the 48ers. He continued correspondence with them, and their perspective was less sort of sanguine when it comes to thinking about American politics. They wrote back to him about how capitalistic or how bourgeois or how conservative or how reactionary the US was in many ways, not entirely. And so even as early as Marx's writings, like, for example, on the Jewish question, he was circumspect about American democracy. So there's kind of like this ongoing dialectic or contradiction Marx had when it came to thinking about the possibilities of socialism or communism in the United States. And they ebbed and flowed, but he wrote extensively for U.S. publications. Now, some of this would have been in the like left-wing socialist press, that especially the German language socialist press that was being published, in like cities like New York, Cincinnati, Milwaukee, Chicago, St. Louis, because he had a lot of his friends, the 48ers there, who would publish his works in German. But the most writing he did in the US, and really the biggest body of work he did outside of maybe Capital, or the Capital sort of like Grundrisse sort of big sort of 1850s and 1860s writings he did on capitalism, were when he was a correspondent for the New York Tribune. This is Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. He wrote hundreds of articles for the New York Tribune as a European correspondent. And in doing so, had to think a lot about his audience, Republican Americans, and learned more about the U.S. from this perspective. And was, I think, impressed and excited by the fact that he had such a large audience. The Tribune at the time was the most read newspaper in the world. 2 times as many people read the New York Tribune as the London Times in the 1850s. And so Marx wrote for the Tribune throughout the 1850s. When the Civil War started, the Tribune had to cut costs, and they fired him essentially. And then he continued to write about the U.S., particularly on the issue of the Civil War, for an Austrian newspaper, and exchanged many, many letters with Engels and many of his comrades in the U.S. about the Civil War. And so, like, for example, his Civil War writings are collected in a book that was originally published by the International Press, the International Publishers, the Communist Party's press, originally published, I believe, in the 1940s or 50s, I want to say. But there's a new edition by the Communists, by the International Publishers, that came out edited by Angela Zimmerman, a former professor of mine. And so, like, readers interested in what he had to say about the Civil War, really interesting writings, can read that. And because he was kind of depressed about world politics during the 1850s, especially after the failure of the 1848 revolutions, the Civil War gave him this optimism that he hadn't had since the 1848 revolutions. He really did see it as sort of like a spark for potential socialist revolution in the US and elsewhere. And the more he wrote and thought about chattel slavery in the US and in the context of capitalism, a sort of capitalist nation, the more it helped him sort of conceptualize what it meant to be free in relation to somebody's labor, in relation to a person's autonomy over self, over time, over their own bodies. And so I think these writings are really important in terms of understanding how he came to his theories in Volume 1 of Capital, especially the kind of famous chapter on the working day, which to me is one of the most important things that Marx ever wrote.
Yeah, I think it's crucial to understand that he was watching events in America. Engels was watching events in America even more closely, and sometimes reading Engels, I think the dialectical tensions in American society were a little bit more obvious to Engels than Marx. But it is interesting to me how important those Civil War writings are, and yet even amongst communists, they're relatively underread. When I've seen them discussed outside of the books that you mentioned, it's either to kind of have Marx be a proto-liberal, or it's to deal with his views on race, which we would not consider super enlightened, but we also would, looking at the opinions of race on the day, find very progressive in a whole lot of ways. So it's interesting to parse that just to the ideas that are the idea that the Civil War actually affected his view of what was otherwise a pretty politically dark time for him after 1848 went up in, flames, more or less.
Yeah, I mean, so his interpretation of the Civil War, in some ways liberal. I don't know. That to me doesn't that is an argument that Eugene Genovese made in the 1970s when he was writing about Marx's writings in the Civil War. This is at a time when Eugene Genovese, the famous historian of the American South, was still on the left, still considered himself, if not a communist, definitely a leftist, a Marxist. And by this point, Genovese, who really was an expert on the antebellum South, but also infamously a little bit too celebratory of the antebellum South, the Confederacy included, as being, to his mind, one way to be anti-capitalist. And so from his perspective, Genovese's perspective, the United States in the context of the Civil War was a liberal capitalist society bent on expansion and domination. And so for Marx to side with the United States in the way that he did, very explicitly, like when he was writing about the Civil War, he was extremely sort of dismissive of like articles coming out of The Economist at the time that made the claim that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, because The Economist was an apologist for the Confederacy, in part because of their very real material interest in sort of like British capitalists, British merchants needing all that cheap cotton for their textile manufacturing. Marx is writing to an English and British working class, trying to keep them on the side of abolition, on the side of the United States against the Confederacy. And to me, like, okay, in the context of the 20th and 21st century, that might sound liberal, but it in the 19th century, to me, was anything but. I think it's more sort of like where the 19th century communists and the 19th century small R Republicans sort of met. I don't know if you've had a chance to read Bruno Leopold's new book, Citizen Marx, which is about Marx's republicanism or his various writings and exchanges with 19th century Republicans. And I would argue that if you wanted to say that Marx's interpretation of the Civil War was not how a Marxist should look at things, which is kind of funny and ironic, maybe it was closer to a 19th century republicanism. But he definitely, like famously thought that it would be impossible for there to be socialism as long as black people were enslaved, as like a class of the working class, a sort of caste of the working class was in a worse condition than the rest of the working class, because it would prevent solidarity of the sort necessary for socialism. And whatever else you'll say about Marx's views on race in the 19th century, that was, to my mind, correct and pretty advanced, radical, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the anti-racist writings, even if you read them in the context of like the 19th century German left romantic movement or something, he's still like very progressive in that he believes that intermarrying is good. There's all kinds of things that they actually believe that we'd be like, oh, that's not something we associate with racist. He does say some not unproblematic things, but I think his writings on slavery are pretty insightful. And one of the things I've always been confused by Genovese and a few other people who have been Marxist defenders or at least apologists for parts of the Confederacy. Not just that doesn't square with anything I know about Marxist politics in the United States and so much of what he was writing for, but also Marx seemed to think that capitalism could incorporate some, quote, pre-capitalist, unquote, forms like chattel slavery and still be capitalist. And I think his writings on the Civil War make that clear. And that's an answer to people like Genovese, who for me is echoing the super racist, ultra problematic George Fitzhugh, who is the, you know, guy who wrote a Sociology for the South, which is the first time the word sociology appears in English, where he argues that basically slavery is anti-capitalist in 1854. And it was weird reading stuff from the 60s and 70s from Marxists. Now we know where Genovese ultimately ends up.
Yeah.
It's like an ultra reactionary, but anyway.
Yeah, so the late great historian Leo Rebuffo, who was my PhD advisor and good friend, was an undergrad student of Genovese's and loved Genovese even up until Genovese's death. And so, of course, remained good friends with him when he became a far-right Catholic. And he said that really, more than being a leftist or a Marxist, Genovese just always hated liberalism. That was the most important aspect of his political identity or his understanding of politics. And so Fitzhugh, if you go back and read his writings on the Mudsill theory, like you could say he definitely hates liberalism. He hates equality, but he also is very critical of what we would understand as like free market capitalism or free labor, as it was known in the 19th century. And Genovese just thought that was like that was an attitude to be celebrated. So Genovese never apologized for slavery, even if his critics might have made that assumption. But he was a little too enamored with the anti-liberalism of some of the antebellum apologists for slavery, even while he was a Marxist. And he thought that there was potentially more affinity for a leftist like him with them than with, like the Republican Party of the 19th century prior to the Civil War.
Yeah, I mean, I find it interesting because he wrote a bunch of defenses in his late Marxist period, early reactionary period of the Southern agrarians who are, they're not studied much outside of the South. I actually, being from Georgia, got them shoved down my throat. So I've read most of the Southern agrarian writings, and some of them are very good poets. I wouldn't adopt any of their politics. Thank you, Alan Tate. But nonetheless, it's very strange for that to come up from a Marxist. But I guess we're going to have to talk about the very strange nature of Marxism in America. One of the things I have recently learned, and because America has this rightful view post the whatever if Red Scare, whether we consider it the second, third, or at my count, it's like the sixth, but of the 1950s. It is interesting how the U.S. socialists were actually at a lot more the forefront of things pretty early on. I remember, for example, the Socialist Propaganda League, which was an American association writing, I can't remember if it was Lenin or Kautsky, about clarifications on what democratic centralism meant. And then also Daniel De Leon, who you write a lot about in your book, for example, got a translation of the Critique of the Goethe Program published in America to critique the SPD, I believe in like 1907. Like it's like ridiculously early. So one of the things your book celebrates is the Gilded Age socialist and Marxists who really did pick up on certain trends of Marxism and were incredibly close readers of Marx before we really think about that scholarship happening, because in English, because for example, it seems like the American branch was often asking questions that it would occur to some of the European branches like 20 years later. So what did you learn in the research for particularly in your second chapter of the book on Gilded Age Marxism, that surprised you about the Marxist reception in America, and how many of them there may have been, in the late 19th century?
Yeah, good question, because there's so much of this book. I mean, and it's a big book, as you figured out, and took a long time to research and write. There's so much in it that I just didn't know what I would find. I knew that I wanted to write a comprehensive overview of how Americans have read and thought about Marx from the time of Marx's life up until the present. And I knew I was already, before starting research on this book, very familiar with like lots of that type of thought in the 1930s on through the 1960s, and just being a sort of left-wing person in the 21st century, I knew that there was stuff I could deal with now, but I had no idea what I was going to find when it came to like the late 19th and early 20th century. And I was surprised not only by the volumes of writings about Marx in the United States at the time, and the depth with which so many people not only read Marx, but tried to put his ideas into action at this time period. That was surprising, because I guess I had previously worked from the assumption that, well, they might have gotten some tangential ideas from, say, German immigrants who had maybe been more familiar with Marx coming from a German working class labor radical context. And that was true, but even more so, they were reading Marx, translating Marx, debating Marx, trying to put Marx's ideas in an American context. And so, it really starts with some of these German 48ers who were formative in like New York City. There was a vibrant Marxist socialist culture in New York City that was first German and then Jewish. Tony Michaels writes this great book on the Jewish left in New York City, and makes the case that when lots of these Jews assimilated to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century in New York City, they weren't assimilating to the US, they were assimilating to sort of Jewish socialist culture in New York City, or I should say German socialist culture in New York City. And part of what was so important to that culture was reading Marx, being familiar with Marx, including Capital, or parts of Capital. Capital in its German translation was pretty widely circulated in these communities. Not so much in English at first, but as you see sort of the expansion of socialism across the continent into places like that were at first heavily German or Jewish, like Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, you then find people who are very serious about translating these into English and spreading the gospel, so to speak. The most important publishing house was the Charles Kerr Company, which was affiliated with the Socialist Party, came out of Chicago. They hired Ernest Unterman, who had wrote a lot about Marx, but also translated all 3 volumes of Capital in the early 20th century. And these, and also wrote, and then this begins also what I would call sort of like a cottage industry of helper manuals, like books ranging from 50 to 300 pages that helped Americans understand Marx in terms that Marx could understand. So Unterman himself wrote a book like this. Lawrence Grunland, the Danish socialist who was very active in the US, wrote a book like this. Even books that we don't necessarily associate with Marxism, like Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, had Marxist connotations because he had read Marx. And so it just becomes extremely common in the culture. Jack London, most famously remembered for his novels or novellas like White Fang. He was a Marxist, a pretty hardcore socialist Marxist, and gave tons and tons of speeches on Marx and Marxism, and then wrote a book, The Iron Heel, that was really deeply rooted in Marx's ideas. And so and what I found so fascinating was not only that all of this was happening, but it was being written and circulated amongst people in the various socialist parties, including the Socialist Party, but also in labor unions, amongst the working class. Like, it's kind of a romantic ideal to think that Marx's writings have always been read by working class people, given that those of us who have spent time with Marx's ideas know how difficult it is to read Marx, especially Capital. And I'm not saying that like a bunch of like socialists and wobblies were hanging out in their tents reading Marx after a hard day's work in the mine, but more working class Americans were reading Marx or trying to read Marx or reading some of the Marx pamphlets than you would think, than probably expect. And that was surprising, pleasantly surprising. And so it made me rethink the sort of like formation of some of the Marxist ideas that came to fruition in the Socialist Party of America and then eventually the Communist Party. It wasn't just that they had sort of like gotten these ideas through osmosis or through their friendships and comradeships and work with maybe European socialists and communists who had read Marx, but they were actually doing the reading and translating and sort of making sense of Marx themselves.
Yeah. One of the things that I was interested in that your book does cover a good bit in the second chapter is the relationship between Marxist social movements and other social, like left-wing social movements that we kind of know about today. I mean, if you're a certain kind of libertarian weirdo, you probably know about Henry George, although you probably don't understand Henry George to have been received in his time as a socialist.
Yeah.
Because I remember learning about Henry George from libertarians because he was an advocate of like a land tax. Yeah. And that was like the only tax he wanted or whatever. But like, George and Marx knew about each other. I think Marx critiqued George, but George wrote nice things about Marx when Marx died. But one of the things I was learning from reading your book is that doesn't end there, that there's a history of Marxist and Georgist interacting in the United States that I didn't know about. Like, like the relationship between the Georgist and Daniel De Leon, who, is a delightful weirdo that takes up a large part of your second chapter. So what did you find interesting there? Because I was really surprised by some of your findings.
Yeah. So the main upshot is that in the late 19th century, this is famously or infamously the Gilded Age, the age of the robber barons. Capitalism was increasingly recognized by more and more people in the U.S. as elsewhere, but especially in the U.S. as a problem. In particular, because it relied upon workers and it relied upon the exploitation of people. Marxists would say workers, but all sorts of people were finding that life was getting increasingly difficult. And so they started looking for solutions, political, sometimes philosophical solutions to this problem. And this is at a time when these problems seemed new. Nowadays, they seem like old and it seems like there's no alternative. But at the time, these were people who might have, say, been peasants from Sicily, or they might have been like small landholders in Kansas, and all of a sudden they're sort of thrown into a capitalist labor market that seems highly exploitative. And people are looking for all kinds of solutions to this problem that seems to be making their lives hell. And they have lots of different people and ideas from which to grab from. Henry George being a classic example. Anarchism, a little bit later, but still one of those ideas. Labor organizing of various sorts, including the Knights of Labor, most famously in this time period. And then populism, which becomes probably the most popular and most powerful because so many of the people being negatively impacted by industrial corporate capitalism at the time were small farmers across the prairie and South. And I guess what's interesting to me is that amongst all of these various ideas, the one that ultimately comes to shape the left the most by the time you get to the progressive era, other than liberalism or progressivism and the mainstream political parties, is Marxism, various forms of Marxism. And you see this in the Socialist Party, eventually of Debs, which is Marxist, maybe not always as explicitly as some of the other left-wing Marxist parties across the 20th century, but is definitely rooted in a form of Marxism. You see this in Daniel De Leon's Socialist Labor Party, of course. You even see this in the Wobblies, especially the industrial workers of the world. And I don't think it's too linear to say that Marxism won out for a time. Like Marx's ideas became kind of like the winning formula for lots of disgruntled, alienated people amongst the working class. Which is not to say there was anything ever near communist or socialist revolution, not in the US by any stretch. But so many people found their way to Marxism, or to the Socialist Party, or various groupings that had a Marxist framework of understanding the problem that they were situated in. And to me, that's it's super interesting. I didn't know that I would find that or make that case, but in a way, it makes perfect sense because Marx had so pinpointed the problem that people being thrown into the proletariat were suffering from.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting in that there's not, like in France or Germany, a whole lot of competing socialisms in the same way. Yes, we had 40AS, yes, we had Owenites, and yes, we had Henry George, but I was actually, like, when I went back and I dug into like the Marxist Party, the history of the SPD, the Socialist Democratic, the Democratic Socialist Party, for those of you who don't get annoyed when I pronounce one set of letters in German and no others. But I found more non-Marxist currents actually in the SPD than I even did in the American Socialist Party. I mean, the Socialist Party of America, because there wasn't other competing traditions to pull from. There wasn't, like in France, you had the Possibilists, you had the Blanquists, you had all kinds of, you had the Blanquillists, you had about 5 different forms of anarchism. We didn't have all of that to the same extent. We did have a lot of French influenced utopian socialists trying to start communes in various places in the 19th century. But in fact, Engels even wrote about them in like 1842. But we didn't have, the same kind of mass movement. And one of the things that makes our revolution a little different from, say, the French is there was not an obvious proto-socialist correlate in the American Revolution the way there was in the French and even in some ways in the English Civil War. But it was interesting to find out how influential it was, because even Marx-friendly historians in the middle of the 20th century kind of don't mention it. Like, I love Christopher Lasch, and Christopher Lasch was no enemy of Marxism at all. But I was surprised to learn how much Marxist activity there was in the late 19th century, because Lasch doesn't even mention it, and he writes a lot about 19th century radicalism.
What I see happening is, as I mentioned previously, Marxist ideas kind of winning out to a certain degree amongst alienated workers and various Americans. But what I see happening is a sort of mixture of Marx's ideas with other sort of more famously, maybe better studied American traditions. So, for example, you get various forms of Christian socialism that emerge in the early 20th century, some of which you might not categorize as Marxism, but some of it's very Marxist, including a number of, like, so, you know, the state with the largest number of Socialist Party members in like the 1910s is Oklahoma. So much so that the Socialist Party in Oklahoma becomes the second, like the challenger in terms of political parties to the state's Democratic Party. There are more socialists than Republicans for about a period of 10 years. And most of these people who became socialists in the Oklahoma Socialist Party were previously populists, and so previously didn't necessarily have a Marxist framework from which to work. But because the Socialist Party was heavily invested in a sort of like grassroots educational mission, many of the Oklahoma socialists, and many of these people are evangelicals and Native Americans, like they come from a very different tradition than like the German and Jewish New Yorkers who were joining the Socialist Party at the time. They started reading Marx and started understanding Marx as a key to them getting freedom. And in fact, many of them sort of like pushed the Socialist Party, at least in Oklahoma, if not nationwide, to take a different position on land, because of course the Socialist Party worked from a very like 1840s Marxist perspective, and like the only people who owned land were aristocrats or proto-capitalists, and recognized that, well, in the context of rural Oklahoma, having a piece of land was like one way to ward off exploitation. And so they had a theory of land that, you know, Marxists across the 20th century in places like Cuba and China would later adopt. And then, of course, this is alongside, say, Milwaukee socialists, very rooted in German Marxism, and yet these were the famous Victor Berger sewer socialists who became kind of social democrats, democratic socialists, but still were heavily invested in a Marxist interpretation of like labor value. Alongside like Marxist women who were challenging the suffrage movement for being too bourgeois, alongside some black socialists like Hubert Harrison, who were obviously in favor of civil rights for black people and were pushing the Socialist Party to take a more pronounced position on that, but were also heavily critical of like the black nationalist perspective of Marcus Garvey or someone like that at the time. And so you have, what I find is that in an American context, Marx's ideas gain this cachet, and then they sort of take new life in various hybrid mongrelized approaches mixing with various other American traditions, Christianity, populism, Black nationalism, feminism, the list kind of goes on.
Yeah, when I was reading your book, particularly with the populist, I was struck by something that always fascinates me with the populist that people don't talk about with them, is the proletariatization of sharecroppers, and how that would have led a lot of former populists to end up in the Socialist Party. And I also think people forget how powerful the People's Party was, even though they didn't, really contest for national elections, but they storm state houses and stuff. Like it's not stuff you read that much about. And then if you look at where they were powerful, where they didn't subsume themselves to the Democrats, like when James Bryant, and you look at where let's say the not quite as German immigrant centered socialists emerged. So clearly the New York socialists are Jewish and immigrant. A lot of these who are socialists are fairly German immigrant tied. And I'm not saying that as a critique, it's just what it is. But then in like 1905, and this is something that your book reminded me, and I looked up, I was like, oh, there were major socialist parties. Okay, Oklahoma's huge, but there was a big one in Utah, which is not something I was expecting. There's a big one in Montana. Basically, the Mountain West and the Midwest was highly sympathetic, particularly after the People's Party kind of, dissolved. And we know like people expect to find it in New York, and they expect to find it in California, and like during the height of the Popular Front in the late 1940s, that was also, those are the two concentration areas. But if you look at the early 20th century, like particularly between like 1905 to like 1920, like there's socialist mayors in Montana, and like there's a major socialist movement in Ogden, Utah, and you're just like finding it in places you absolutely wouldn't expect to find it now. And go ahead.
Yeah, so like probably the most militant and radical workers in the whole US in the early 20th century were miners in the Rocky Mountains. And that's because they were the most exploited. And these were mostly immigrants coming from like syndicalist traditions. Many of them had joined the Wobblies. A good portion of them joined the Socialist Party, as you said. And they had, some of them might have read Marx, but they just had a sort of like innate Marxism. They understood that capital was the enemy and that they had to get organized against capital. And, mostly they lost these struggles. It was very, infamously brutal time to try to organize unions in the Rocky Mountain West. Most infamously, the Ludlow Massacre is a sort of part of this struggle. But out of this, like you probably don't get the formation of the industrial workers of the world, or at least you don't get its popularity in the West if you don't have these radical miners unions, in particular in Colorado and Idaho and Montana. And this was like real as class warfare has been in the US. People were killed routinely by police, and people were set up, including Bill Hayward and other leaders of the union, and arrested and put on trial for murders they did not commit. This was if we had a more class conscious Hollywood industry, there's some great films to be made of some of these struggles.
Yeah, unfortunately we got Mate One and they stopped there.
Good film.
Great film. Don't have any problem with it, but like you don't get a lot about the Rocky Mountains where the fighting was even at a higher pitch. I guess this brings me to one of the most charismatic figures of American socialism, which is Eugene Debs, and he's also kind of a transition figure between this Gilded Age Marxism and the Marxism that exists after the liberal response to the Russian Revolution. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about Debs, but one of the things I learned this from reading Christopher Lash's a dissertation on liberals in America and their response to the Russian Revolution, is that let's call it proto-left liberalism, because I don't have a good way to describe it, but we're not really dealing with progressives yet. We're not really dealing with socialists. But it is unclear at the early 20th century up to 1917 where a lot of the liberals are going to land in relation to the Bolshevik Revolution. How is Debs kind of a transitionary figure between these two time periods? And then we can talk about the liberals.
Sure. Yeah, there's just so much I learned researching and writing this book, but I had read a couple of biographies of Debs, but like doing more sort of primary source research and finding Debs in the archives was really revealing. He's sort of representative of these Americans who were grasping for solutions to the problems of industrial capitalism. And he tried out a whole bunch of solutions, including utopian socialism, including just what I would consider a more sort of like non-Marxist Christian socialism. And he eventually lands on Marx in part due to the influence of Victor Berger, who was bringing him capital while he was in prison in Woodstock, Illinois. So various socialist parties in the late 19th and early 20th century were sort of vying for, I guess, what you would say, hegemony over what appeared to be a growing left-wing working class America. And all of them wanted Debs as their sort of figurehead. Well, more than figurehead, but they wanted Debs as their spokesperson because he was a legitimate working class hero after Homestead. And eventually Debs decides that he is a Marxist and that the solution to the problem of industrial capitalism is for the working class to not only gain power, including political power, but also that power over the point of production, like autonomy at the factories. And so he takes the Socialist Party, or he's part of the Socialist Party moving towards a very explicitly Marxist position. But there had been like 50 years of debates on the left about whether or not, and some of these debates might sound familiar, whether or not socialists, Marxists should merely just focus on organizing the working class, or if they should rather focus, or in addition focus on the American political system, like trying to get people elected. And Debs was the key figure in moving the Socialist Party towards a sort of hybrid approach. They're going to continue to try and organize the working class, but they're also going to run for election, especially at the local level in places like Milwaukee and Oklahoma and other places, but also at the national level. And so part of the appeal of socialism at the national level was the fact that they had, in many people's eyes, like a viable presidential candidate. Debs runs for president 5 separate times. In 1912, the kind of famous election of 1912, he gained several million votes. Now, he didn't come anywhere close to, he was a distant fourth in that election to Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt and Howard Taft. But, winning millions of votes then, and also in 1920 running from prison, still winning millions of votes, he becomes like a legitimate alternative to American progressivism. It wouldn't have been called liberalism yet. Well, some people called it liberalism, but mostly this is like progressivism. And that is, rather than sort of like tinkering at the edges in efforts to regulate corporations, he really truly wanted working class people to have full power over the country. And there becomes a bit of a divide that gets much, much, much more pronounced after the Bolshevik Revolution.
Yeah, I think that's important. The various progressive responses to Marxism are interesting because, like I said, both your book and I'm also thinking about Christopher Lash's the first book about this too. There was more sympathy initially than one would expect. But I think that sours for some people even before the Russian Revolution, but it sours for a bunch of people after. How does the Russian Revolution like move progressivism and socialism into more an antagonistic movement that I think also today people don't really think about progressives and socialists as being antagonists to one another exactly. But I mean, it seems like progressivism in some ways was born to be a like left liberal response and eventually like competing ideology set to Marxism.
Yeah. And there were always hints of this division, but they weren't as pronounced and they didn't sort of take concrete form, I think, until the Bolshevik Revolution. So the Russian Revolution happens, and Marxists, for the most part, in 1917, were celebratory. Like, this is great. This is what they want in the US. This is what they've been fighting for. Whereas liberals thought that the Kerensky government, the provisional government, that was democratic. That's what they wanted. And the Leninist, in their eyes, coup or takeover of that particular post-Tsarist Russia was, in a way, a sort of like bastardized return of Tsarism. And then, as events play out in the Russian Civil War over the next 3 or 4 years, they just become increasingly horrified. I mean, this is a long history of liberals flirting with the left, but then demonstrating their horror at the results of any type of leftist victory or power, working class victory or power. I mean, this is 1840. These are the lessons of the 1848 revolutions that Marx wrote so much about afterwards, and that completely tainted him towards alliance with liberalism. But so you see this, but this has a dialectical effect that I think harms the left, harms Marxism in the US, because by sort of recognizing that socialists or communists could come to power in a state, understandably so, lots of American Marxists want to model their movement in the US on the Bolsheviks, and they create close ties with the Communist Party and the Soviet Union. And that's when you see the sort of like breakdown of the Socialist Party, which had a much wider base, and the formation of a couple of different communist parties that eventually ends up being the Communist Party of the USA. And, I write about it historically, so I'm not like a polemicist or a sectarian on this issue, but I just think that was probably a mistake because the situation in the US was so much different than it was in Russia. And it failed. So I guess in retrospect, you could say it was a mistake, although I'm not sure anything would have succeeded. But this had a sort of like doubly problematic effect because it created sectarianism, whereas the Socialist Party had not solved, but had alleviated a lot of sectarian issues in the American left. And it also led to massive backlash. So like the Red Scare following the First World War, following the Bolshevik Revolution, I would argue was almost as damaging to the left as the Red Scare, the more famous one following the Second World War, what we call McCarthyism. It just wrecked the left. And I'm not saying that had the left not adopted the Bolshevik model, that there wouldn't have been a Red Scare, because, the reactionary capitalist class doesn't worry itself with these distinctions. But being such sort of like open defenders of the Bolshevik Revolution, and also creating close ties with the Soviet Communist Party made it much easier for the federal government on down to state and local governments to crack down on communists, socialists, wobblies. I mean, basically, the Bolshevik Revolution and the American sort of sympathy, the American left sympathy for it helped allow the state to completely and utterly crush the wobblies, a long-time objective.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like the 1920s is one of the worst periods for the U.S. left for all of these factors. And again, I'm not sure they're historians don't always deal in counterfactuals. I think it's healthy to think about this counterfactual. I'm not sure there's a better alternative left in the 1920s. Had we had like the Debsian Socialist Party just maintained its perspective, would it have been different? I mean, part of the problem is the Debsian Socialist Party was cracked down on. Debs was in prison for opposing American entry into the war. So lots and lots of historians have argued that the American sort of alignment with the Bolsheviks was the wrong move. To me, it was like an understandable move. Maybe the wrong move, but I'm not sure there was a better move as well. But it wasn't a good development. I'll say that.
Well, it does seem, particularly after Debs dies, leads to the SPA taking a more and more accommodationist, if not outright, in some cases in the 1950s, reactionary standing. I mean, one of the differences, I think, between the SPA in the 1920s and the 1950s is like the SPA does not participate in the Red Scare of the 1920s. They're victims of it. But in the 1950s, they actually side with the government. So it's an interesting problem. But I do think your book reminds me, because when we often talk about the first Red Scare, and I'm gonna put that in quotation marks because I don't actually think it's the first Red Scare.
Which I show in my book. There are many, many Red Scares.
Yeah. The 19th century is full of them. Like it's but I was always taught that it was mostly aimed at anarchists, and the anarchists kind of were the most high profile people that they went after. But and I don't even know why I didn't put it together, but I was like, yeah, Debs is in prison, right? Yeah. And you're always sold that, it's about his anti-war activism, which is technically true, but also misses the point, because like even in the 1950s, you're not dealing with like Gus Hall or anybody in the Socialist Workers' Party being in prison while they're like the head of a party. That's not a thing that you read about. So it is sort of like, there's a big difference here.
And that to me,
Red Scare erased from the memory so much. Go ahead.
Yeah, what many people refer to as the first Red Scare. I agree with you. It's not the first, but it's the first like widespread. Well, no, I wouldn't even go that far. It is an extremely, extremely damaging, repressive Red Scare. Mm-hmm. In many ways, worse than the second Red Scare because the left had a lot of vibrancy and was gaining political power in various places. So, like, during this time period, for example, Victor Berger, who had been elected to Congress as a socialist out of Wisconsin, was like kicked out of Congress, not voted out, kicked out. Debs is thrown in prison. The Wobblies are just crushed. Many of them are killed. There are instances of hundreds of Wobblies being put on a train in one state and just trucked to another state just to get them out of a state. 1,000 anarchists and socialists and communists or whatever Marxists are deported to Russia, the Soviet Union, famously. there are in New York City and Chicago and other big cities where there were lots of Russian immigrants. There were like organizations that had close ties to the Soviet Union that were just completely gutted, hundreds of people thrown in prison. And then that's not even to mention the crackdown on any type of civil rights activism, which the federal government conveniently linked to anarchism, socialism, communism, bullshit. I mean, at the time they just called it Bolshevism. Anything that the reactionary powers that be deemed threatening, they called Bolshevism, or said it was the result of Bolshevist influence. So that, I mean, that was a really damaging Red Scare. It wasn't as high profile as the second one. It didn't have such a famous face as Joseph McCarthy, but it was a really, really damaging one.
I mean, in many ways, it was bloodier. I mean, that's something that I think we don't
For sure.
we don't talk
Without
about
a
as
doubt.
much. Like
Without
they
a
didn't
doubt.
kill that many people in the 1950s. Like, but they
No. Just
there's
the
thousands dead
Rosenbergs.
in the 20s. Like
Famously the Rosenbergs, a few others, but no, like lots of people were killed and deported in the like 3 or 4 years following World War One, during and following World War One.
Your book actually goes into the beginning of what we might call Black Bolshevism, which I think it's finally being kind of talked about. You know, Hammer and Hoke came out, I don't know now, 30 years ago or 40 years ago. I can't remember, but it's, you know, been a while.
Yeah.
Which talks about it in Alabama, where it was a serious contender amongst the Black community. But, you know, you actually find that there are Black socialists with sympathies to Bolshevism, like earlier than I thought we would. And so you read about A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen, you know, declaring for it in the Messenger, like from day one, like, you know, as early as 1917. So, how is Marx influential on the intersection between, say, Black radicals in the civil rights movement and socialists?
Well, there's always been, so like the Black left is quite diverse and always has been diverse. And I think one of the sort of like problems, the horse blinders of white American liberals going back to the early 20th century is the assumption that like Black radicals are all cut from the same cloth.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's a bad cloth and sometimes it's a good cloth, but it's always the same cloth. But since forever, there's been as much diversity amongst Black activists, Black radicals, Black leftists as white leftists. And so even as early as like the 1870s with someone like Peter Clark, who was the first Black Marxist elected or who ran for public office in Cincinnati, there have been Marxists, Black Marxists, who understood that civil rights was a major, maybe the barrier to them enjoying freedom in the US. Like they lacked it because of the various institutions that prevented Black people from being free. But these people also, in reading Marx and Marxist literature, thought that true freedom was impossible in a capitalist society, and that they linked up their unfreedom as Black people with their unfreedom as humans or as workers. And so there's just always been that tradition on the Black left, which is why there have been Black people in every major Marxist party who have been active and sometimes even have been famous as intellectual or political leaders in various Black Marxist, various left-wing Marxist parties or Marxist organizations in U.S. history. It's just a really, to me, important strain of Marxism in the U.S. To me, like every era has at least a couple of interesting of these types of figures that I examine in the book, starting with Peter Clark in the 1870s in Cincinnati, but also extending to, as you mentioned, A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen, the publishers of The Messenger, both of whom, especially Randolph, become famous for other things later in ways that people would probably not categorize them as Marxist. But he got his start. They both got their start at City College reading Marx together, and that really shaped their understanding of the world.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I always credit the CPUSA for is like the reason like we had a Black intellectual tradition after the first Harlem Renaissance is largely because the communists were continuing to fund it. Which is something that is off missed when we're reporting on this, because I'm like, some of them become ex-Marxist, some of them like Richard Wright and Harry Crews even become anti-Marxist.
And they're always the ones who are most famous because American intellectuals, especially liberals, celebrate them for turning against Marxism, but others are forgotten, and there are often lots of these others who stuck with Marxism.
Oh yeah, I mean, even ones that you can't drop, like you can't talk about Black American culture without talking about W.E.B. Du Bois. I was taught him in middle school, but you best damn well believe they did not mention he was a Marxist. Like, no. They mentioned that he was more radical than George Washington Carver and pretty much left it at that.
Yeah,
and right. And so even the ones that stayed Marxist, we don't hear about, but Baldwin and Richard Wright and even Harry Crews, those are often celebrated. I think Harry Crews less so because of his Black nationalism and maybe anti-Semitism. But maybe. Yeah. I've read the book and I'm like, it's possibly deniable, but it don't look good. Yeah. But a lot of the ones that stayed, even the ones that are important, so like Lorraine Hansberry, who's very important to like Black theater, I don't remember until I was in university, no one mentioned that she was a Marxist in her entire life, that she had a relationship to the Communist Party of America. And like,
well, I mean, even so, I've considered myself a leftist and a Marxist now for, 25 plus years. And as a trained U.S. historian, I've read Du Bois. I've read a lot of Du Bois, but I guess until I really dug into this book and read Black Reconstruction and learned more about the sort of background of him writing that book, I just didn't think of him quite to the extent as I now do as a Marxist. And that was a really fun, revealing part of researching and writing this book as well.
So another thing that you do talk about is the idea of the academic Marxist or the communist intellectual is something that developed in America earlier than I thought. Like, I usually associate it with the end of the New Left, where we all give up and like, fuck it, the trade unions and do what we want, so we're just gonna go be professors now, which is a profoundly unfair generalization, but one that's kind of true. In addition to being unfair. But I, like, reading your work, I was like, oh, there were Marxist intellectuals in America that I didn't even know about as early as 1920. Oh, yeah. So you want to talk about some of them? like who were some of the people you found that surprised you?
Maybe not surprising, but the 1930s were just such a rich time for Marxism. Marxism explodes in the US during the 1930s, for obvious reasons. But in not always the most obvious places. So the philosophy department at NYU becomes a hotbed for Marxism, especially with Sidney Hook and James Burnham. I really enjoyed reading the works and about the production of these works in the 1930s, when these people who became much more famous as conservatives or neoconservatives after World War II, during the Cold War, when they were just like gung-ho Marxists who wanted communist revolution and were really thinking in creative ways, especially Sidney Hook, thinking in creative ways about how to blend Marxism with American traditions that in ways that would make sense to more and more people. But also hilariously, once he becomes a conservative, so Sidney Hook, he really is a conservative by the 60s. He kind of goes from Marxism to a little bit of Trotskyism to liberalism, Cold War liberalism, to Republican Party conservatism, and writing for the National Review. During this trajectory, by the 1960s, when there's a bunch of new young leftists all over the place, growing interested in Marxist literature and Marxist philosophy, someone wants to bring out his famous book, Towards an Understanding of Karl Marx, which was written and published in 1933, wants to bring out a new edition, and he forbids it because he doesn't want to associate with his younger self. I mean, even if that's just amazing to me. Or Kenneth Burke, who I found an equally fascinating Marxist figure from the 1930s, who wrote a lot about culture and ideology. He was one of these many intellectuals who recognized that maybe the economic conditions were ripe for socialism, but that not enough Americans were buying into it. And so maybe culture and ideology were the real problem they had to solve. This becomes a whole cottage industry in the 1930s. Kenneth Burke's one of the more interesting figures of these people trying to figure this out. And he writes a number of really great Marxist books in the 30s and even into the early 40s. But by the time you get to the 1950s, he doesn't become conservative, not even close, but he becomes a kind of famous academic writing about literature and philosophy. And new editions of his book, he censors out certain words, including references to Marx. All of this was just fascinating. I mean, and I think one of the things I hope my book does is just sort of like, if anyone thought that there wasn't Marx and there wasn't Marxism in various points in American history, this hopefully will teach them otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, but you do actually spell out that even a lot of the dreaded mid-century liberals, like the Niebers and Schlesinger, are actually in some ways products of this 30s Marxist renaissance that happens. And they're kind of, part of this mass defection in the early 50s. And which I think is part of where the myth, and I do think it is a myth, of like, oh, well, all the Trotskyists became neoconservatives, because yes, a lot of them are Trotskyists, but actually, if you go through I've gone through the numbers of like 50s uber conservatives who were communists in the 30s, from James Burnham to even Whittaker Chambers. I'm like, there's not one tendency I can actually pull them from. Like there's a lot of just straight up Marxist-Leninists who flip too. It's actually surprising how thorough this seems to be. So, we talked about this kind of dialectically antagonist relationship between progressivism and Marxism as first maybe a little friendly, but we should know better from European history, and then it going south pretty thoroughly in the 20s. Why do you think so many of these intellectuals turn on their earlier selves in the 40s and 50s?
Well, yeah, that's the big question of chapter 5 of my book. What I argue is Marx was so central to intellectual life, high intellectual and mid intellectual life in 1930s America, that anybody, no matter what position they were taking in the 40s and 50s, whether they were trying to carve out a new type of left, whether they wanted to stick to Marxism, which isn't not very many of those, whether they had become a liberal or were continuing as liberals, because lots of these liberals in the 50s were liberals in the 30s, but weren't anti-Marxist in the 30s. They became anti-Marxist by the 40s and 50s. Or conservatives, they all had to address Marx. It was like, I think I used the metaphor that they had to exercise their demons, right?
Mm-hmm.
And liberals in particular in this time period were fabricating like a new American political tradition. They didn't think it was new, but it's very new when you look at it as this like pragmatic, centrist liberalism that was not fascism, was not the conservatism of the South, and also was not Marxism or communism, and was better, more revolutionary, it offered more freedom, and it had defeated fascism and was on the verge of defeating communism as well. But they defined this American political tradition almost entirely against Marxism, whether it was Schlesinger, whether it was Niebuhr, who was exercising his own Marxist demons, whether it was Walt Rostow, who kind of formulated a theory of American global development that was anti-Marxist, but explicitly in a Marxist tone. I mean, he subtitled his most famous book about development, Stages of Growth, subtitled it A Non-Communist Manifesto. The list goes on and on. Like every single liberal intellectual of the mid 20th century whom you've read and know about or heard about wrote about Marx, oftentimes extensively, in ways that helped them sort of formulate a whole political philosophy that they believed represented American liberalism.
So I guess that brings me to the second half of your 5th chapter and also your chapter 6, which is about the New Left, which I hate to say, for most American Marxists today, they study European history until about 1950. Then we jump over and start caring about America, which is also, I think, a problem why it's so hard to talk about the American Marxist history, because Marxists themselves often don't study it. But they do know this time period a little better, partly because the baby boomers come from there, so we all get this shoved down our throats more, but partly because I think also there's more mass media. It's a more relatable mass media to us. The media environment post-war is closer to our own. I mean, barring the internet really changing things, but at least closer to the one that you and I grew up with. How do you think these perceptions of Marx change, both with post-war conservatism, which is really interesting because I think your book kind of spells out there's the post-war conservatism is dominant throughout American life in the 1950s, but how far people take it varies dramatically. And then you also, when you go back and write about the reception of Marx and then you left imagination, actually work out some things that I find surprising. Like, I often joke that today a lot of people have been so influenced by anti-communism, they think communism is what happens when you just flip that on its head. Just whatever the anti-communist said that we did, it was bad. Well, no, we did it, but it was good. But I think your book actually indicates to me this tendency is like not particularly new. We see this even in some of the new leftists in the 1960s. So how does the American reception of Marx change with the 1-2 of post-war conservatism and then the new left?
So post-war conservatism was deeply embedded in the Red Scare. And so it was an attempt to rid the US of Marxism, of course. But even more than that, it was an effort to fight and diminish liberalism, which of course was the most potent and powerful political philosophy in mid-century America. And so whereas liberals at the time were arguing against Marx and Marxism in an effort to sort of firm up their own political philosophy, conservatives were writing about and arguing with Marx and Marxism, not just as part of this sort of like Red Scare effort to crush communism, but even more so to lump it together with liberalism, to make the case that, in fact, the New Deal was like Marxism in liberal clothing, liberal sheep's clothing. And this is a tendency that runs straight through to the present with the right. The right has, I mean, they did this in the first Red Scare, in which they labeled anything they disliked Bolshevism. The second Red Scare, McCarthyism, was really an effort to not just crush Marxism, because it wasn't very vibrant at that time, but also to crush the labor movement or certain elements of the labor movement, and in particular to diminish New Deal liberalism. So I think liberalism is hegemonic, but conservatism is on the rise and making a lot out of the Cold War and the Red Scare. And when a new left emerges in the 1960s, it emerges in a context in which liberalism has been under attack and is still powerful. And so then you combine that with like the Vietnam War, which was a liberals' war, and young new leftists see nothing redeemable in liberalism, even though I would argue, and many historians have argued, that much of the new left was very closely akin to liberalism. And so like I would say a lot of people on the left now, not some people on the left now, and some historians would argue that the new left was not Marxist. The new left was rooted in the liberation movements of the 60s and the counterculture and the anti-war movement, which was not always Marxist. Lots and lots and lots of new leftists were engaging with Marx during the 1960s and after. And this wasn't necessarily surprising to me, but the ways in which they were engaging with Marx, I think, is not widely understood. So I'm hoping people will pick that up from my book. So, like, for example,
what are some of the
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, just ask you, what are some of the misconceptions that you think?
Yeah. Well, you know, there's this ongoing sort of Marxist left critique of identity politics that's been sort of prevalent for the last 20 years, that you see really flower with, for example, I don't know, like the various liberal criticisms of the Bernie Sanders campaign. You know, like these are the debates that lots of people on the left are contemporaneously are very familiar with. That's kind of how the new left has often been sort of like read. Not a serious left, not a Marxist left, not a sort of like labor first left. But so many new leftists were reading Marx. You know, like I focus, for example, on Left Studies, which is a magazine that was published out of Madison by a bunch of grad students at the university there, mostly history grad students. that became highly sort of influential amongst the New Left. And they were writing extensively about Marx and Marxists and doing Marxist interpretations of various things. And they and many others had like been a part of this rediscovery or new discovery of the young Marx. And so in the 1940s and 50s, there's this these people coming out of Detroit like Raya Dunaiskeva, Grace Lee, and of course C.L.R. James, who are doing a bunch of translations of the young Marx. Now, some intellectuals in the 1930s, like Sidney Hook, who could read German, had read the young Marx and had incorporated like On the Jewish Question and German ideology and Theses on Feuerbach. They've incorporated that into some of their analyses. But for the first time in the 1940s, these texts were translated into English for an American audience, and they become like widely circulated amongst the New Left in the 1960s, who are not necessarily a labor left the way the Gilded Age left was, more like a kind of ragtag, many college students, many civil rights activists, just various anti-war protesters who felt alienated from the liberal society, and this young Marx, especially his writings about alienation, really spoke to them. So that's part of it. But then the Vietnam War leads people further and further on the left. And so there are just many explorations of Marx and other Marxist writings due to the war itself and the resistance to the war.
Yeah, I find the New Left to be fascinating. For one thing, I think one thing that is in play with Marxists in the New Left that is not in play with Marxists prior to the 1950s is divisions in the global communist world, which didn't exist in the 1920s, basically. I mean, you had Russia, and that was pretty much it. And then the Soviet bloc, but that was pretty much it. So the Sino-Soviet split really, I think, confounds things. And then the other thing I think that confounds things is that what we call the New Left in my mind has like three different phases, and there's like this Marxian beginning, and then there's like the like intermixed period, and then by the 70s you're getting to the new communist movement where the communists have kind of come back into the fore. And I'm not saying it went well, like, but it was actually Marxist. It wasn't just like namby-pamby liberal identity politics or anarchism. It's actually surprising how little anarchism there is in the New Left. I was actually like, when I actually studied them, I was like, you guys are wrong. There's not that much anarchism in the New Left, like at all.
No.
So some liberalism maybe, but there's not a lot of anarchism.
Well, to go back to my earlier discussion of the Socialist Party and how what I found was like Marxism sort of mixing in hybrid form with all these other different American traditions. You see this extensively in the New Left. You have Black Panthers who are sort of interpreting Marx in their own way. You have countercultural hippie anti-war protesters interpreting Marx in their own way. The list goes on. You have robust debates amongst feminists about Marx in a sort of New Left context. And so anytime there's what I call a Marx boom, that is, I see it, there are 4 periods in American history in which there's like a huge uptick in Americans reading Marx favorably. He gets read in a wide assortment of ways. And that was especially true in the 1960s. Part of it is like there's just so much sort of anger at quote unquote the system, and people are grasping for all different sort of like traditions or ways to think about how to oppose the system. And of course, capitalism, even in the 1960s, when it's sort of like at its apex in terms of the golden age for Western capitalism, and a lot of these people were not as sort of poor, precarious, or exploited as as people would be before or after, they sort of connect the system that they hate to capitalism. And so of course they're going to find Marx, even if, for example, the Marx of Capital, the Marx of the working day chapter in Capital is not really the Marx they're latching onto. They're latching onto different forms of Marx.
Which is in many ways understandable. I mean, like, one of the things that I've always found interesting is that the New Left does happen at the tail end of what is like the high point of not just capitalism, but also capital integration. Like, workers actually are fairly well integrated into the Fordist apparatus, are the social democratic apparatus in Europe. I use that in quotation marks advisedly. And so, you know, it does seem odd actually for that to be a high point of Marxism, but there's so much discontent. The international empires are really beginning to unravel. The role of the US as the replacement for the British Empire, it seems to be dawning on Americans actually finally what that is and means. And I find that fascinating. I think your book covers it relatively well, and it is interesting. And it's one of these things I think about. You keep on hinting about all this syncretism, and I was thinking about this in regards to any movement. On one hand, as I'm not a true orthodox Marxist, I don't even know what that actually means, but in so much that it is a thing, you know, I would like to pretend that I was that. And yet, it would be weird if somehow there was an idea set that could remain so pure that it never hybridizes with anything.
Like, that would be very weird. That's not how history works at all.
Right.
And yet, so totally true. And yet there's like a kernel of the Marxist idea in Capital from the working day about how our labor in a capitalist system is exploited, that people return to and again, especially during times when labor exploitation seems especially pronounced. Gilded Age, 1930s, now. Like there's been just to sort of jump ahead a little bit, but there's been a serious return to that Marx in a lot of writings in the US and elsewhere about Marx. The difference is a lot of the new writings on Marx is not only sort of focused on the sort of labor Marx, so they're focused on the ways in which capitalism explicitly exploits people, but also focused on how people under such arrangements cannot be free. So there's this real focus on freedom, which to me seems like a sort of post-Cold War way to return to Marx that maybe sheds the baggage of the Soviet Union. Although the Soviet Union is not really pronounced in a lot of the new literature because it's now 35 years in the rearview mirror. But it's sort of like all you people talk about freedom. Well, why aren't we free? And why, especially, are we so repressed at the place where we spend so much time, that is at work? So much of the new Marxist literature that I write about in the final chapter is pitched in those terms. And I find that, I guess, fascinating and also really sort of like resonating, not just with me, but with lots of people in this current moment. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I will say about Marxism today, and I'm not necessarily saying we're at a high point right now, although it does seem interesting that I have Zoomer kids claiming to be Marxist-Leninists who, when I ask them what they think that means, give me all kinds of wild answers, which I actually don't necessarily think should be unexpected or is necessarily bad either. But you know, this Marx revival after 2007, we're looking at it hitting almost a generation long. So It's like it's not going away anytime real soon, and it did seem in the beginning to even catch the conservatives off guard, because they're like, oh wait, it's harder to tar these guys as liberals, and we've kind of fallen off of our Cold War game, so we're not as good at it.
I tentatively say we're in our fourth Marx boom in American history, but I say tentative because there's not really an organizational or institutional structure for it the way there was in the previous Marx booms. But there's just been a full flowering of literature on Marx and a return of lots of people reading Marx that can be measured in book sales, in book groups, in like organized readings. And there's just like a whole library of books that have been written about Marx and Marxist ideas in the last 15, 20 years. And that was not true in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah. I do think your book is interesting because I will admit the chapters on the 80s and 90s are a downer. If you like Marx at all, it's just like, yeah, there's Marxist ideas. They get really weird though, and they barely exist. I mean, you know, to really unfairly gloss those chapters. But I mean, that's when the idea of the Marxist theorist, it's a primary form of Marxist engagement, really seems to come out. I mean, it does have a kind of popular explosion in 1999 when Hart and Negri's Empire comes out, and like, you're now in history that I remember. And I do remember that book when I was either a freshman in college or a senior in high school, being on the New York Times bestseller list, and me picking it up as a freshman in college or a senior in high school and going, what the fuck is this gobbledygook, and how is this selling so well?
It was all the rage. I read it like 3 times in 3 different reading groups. And my rereading of it as research for this book was a pretty wild experience, because I'm like, I liked this.
Right.
Doesn't speak to me the same way now, but that's the way things work.
I mean, one thing you do document is the 90s are the 90s. It's funny when I hear people kind of claim the new left was anarchistic, because I'm like, no, the left of my childhood was anarchistic. That was the 90s. Like, anarchist and movementist were like the only people I met, and then occasionally slightly annoying Trotskyists from British tendencies. Like, that was it. Like, you didn't really meet a whole lot of other people. I guess occasionally, if you got through International Answers Front, you maybe would meet the PSL or the WWP. But like, in general, you didn't really meet Marxist groups, but you did encounter Marxist theorists. But even then, I mean, it was like, you know, through Hart Negri or through Derrida or through the French post-Marxist or whatever. It was like looking through a mirror darkly and being like, I think there's some Marx here, but like, I just read the manifesto and I don't know what the fuck this has to do with that.
Yeah, I mean, so as I try to articulate in the final chapter, where I do just a tiny bit of autobiography. You know, I'm Gen X, was not a propitious time to grow up to be a Marxist.
No.
At all. And yet I still became one. So I would consider myself in a way a sort of like child of the academic Marx of the 80s that was so dark. But clearly I think I was looking for something more. But like, Marxism to me, when I first discovered it, was about reading groups. I mean, there were radicals doing other things, and that kind of came to the forefront, especially with like the anti-World Trade Organization protests in Seattle and DC and elsewhere. But mostly, if I wanted to go like partake in an action, it'd be like a Columbus Day parade. We'd be protesting or something like that. It was hard to sort of like see Marxism in action, at least for me. I'm sure it was out there. So that's what is so interesting, is after especially the financial collapse 2007 and 8, of seeing like a real flowering of it. And it's still here, but where it goes, I don't know. And there's not, to me, there's not really org form, but there's a lot of books to read and a lot of ideas to talk about with people. And that's not nothing.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because I do agree with you. It doesn't feel like there's an org, and yet the DSA is the equivalent size adjusted for population, even after losing a bunch of people, of the SDS in the 60s. So, like, there's something there. But I agree with you. There hasn't been, I mean, honestly, it was kind of lacking in the 60s too, because the sectarian fragmentation amongst the New Left was pretty thorough. But
yeah, but in the 60s, everyone knew there wasn't a left, and everyone knew that it was making it difficult for the state to wage war in Vietnam. Like, that's a pretty important thing that I don't know that the current left can't really claim anything like that as an accomplishment.
No, not even with Palestine. One thing I would say is, in general, I will say whatever the tactics the New Left developed to handle things, they've been so normalized and routinized that the state has a total grasp on how to deal with them at this point. Like, mass protest walks, just, they might serve a purpose, but they're not the purpose that you think they are. Let me put it that way. I'm not gonna say they're purposeless, but like, they don't change policy. They don't even signal real mass opposition the way that they kind of did in the 60s. And I think part of that isn't to do with Marxism. It's to do with larger changes in American society, like the end of the draft, the increasing, like, yes, Democrats cry about democracy ending all the time, but like, everyone's been ending democratic institutional responsiveness for like 40 years. Really since the New Left. So I do agree with you. Go ahead.
I mean, this is to agree with you, but I would just say that it's hard to know if or whether the current Marx boom, as I call it, and I'm tentative about claiming that, is going to take any type of like substantial political form. But even in researching this history, I came across so many surprising things. So I guess I hope to be surprised again in the future. And you know, things happen that are surprising. Like, nobody expected the left to emerge in the 1960s. Like, nobody expected that, especially after the McCarthy era, and it happened. So it's good to keep hope even in these dark, depressing times.
Right. I mean, to be fair, no one expected the Marx resurgence after 2008 either. Even the weird sectarians who benefited from it were kind of surprised.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, exactly.
You know, I was sauntering towards Marxism after a brief stint as a reactionary in my early 20s. And like, even I was like, wait, there are people who agree with me? I remember like feeling shocked because I was like, I only thought like some weird English professor and like the historians, where you're, for some reason, Marx. I will say, one of the, as a boon to the field of history, Marxist historiography during all these periods has never been totally wiped out. Marxist economics, that's a different story.
Well, I think, if I could say, and I say this proudly as a historian, historians are usually like slower to respond to academic trends, theoretical trends. And so we do eventually respond, and those responses are not always great, but it's allowed Marxism, it's allowed some of us to remain Marxists and as historians with Marxist approaches. there's never been a time since Du Bois when there haven't been a few Marxist historians here or there.
Right. And like, there are some, like, there are heterodox economic schools, but even though, like, University of Utah, where I live, is actually heterodox, for some weird reason, the Mormons invited all the communists to, like, come here when they wouldn't sign the anti-communist pledge in Berkeley. And, like, we're like, the Mormons like, we don't really care what you teach. Just come over here and teach, which I find fascinating. But even it's not consistently Marxist. Like, it's
some Keynesians thrown in
there. some neo and post Keynesians and some MMTers and some other kinds of heterodox whatever. Whereas Marxist historiography, at least, even certain conservative historians will like nod some kind of respect to it. I remember Marshall Poe saying like he couldn't totally throw Marxist historiography out. Like he was just like, they were at least trying to be scientific, and who else is doing that? Right now, as we can talk about this in terms of history, but like historians are kind of stuck between like the Marxists are the only people who still try to maintain a systemic truth, and they're not only people, but we're pretty close, because most everybody else is kind of seem freaked out about grand movements of history, so they just kind of write about microhistory now. So like, it's unfair, but also true. Like,
that was definitely true 10, 20 years ago. I feel like we're moving in a different direction now, but so hey, Derick, we've been talking for almost 2 hours.
Yeah, we can cut out.
I've enjoyed it a lot.
So where can people find your work, Andrew?
Well, this book, as well as my last book, the University of Chicago Press website will have links to them. I'm still on the old X Twitter thing, or Bluesky. Just find me. Any place books are sold. Including the ultimate capitalist institutions owned by Bezos and Musk and the like.
Yep. I guess Powell's is still kind of it's a capitalist institution, but I guess it's still kind of independent. I don't know. Like,
you can buy my book directly from the University of Chicago Press, which is nonprofit, and which, interestingly enough, I think as a nonprofit press, their mission is to publish work. I mean, I think my book will sell enough to make the press get out of the red, but most academic books don't turn any profit. And so academic presses, in order to survive, have to have some books that turn a profit. The University of Chicago Press has a bunch of works from Hayek and Friedman that really keep the engine running. So Hayek and Friedman are helping with the publication of this book on Karl Marx.
That's a very funny thought to end this conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Hartman.
Yeah, thanks, Derick. It's really fun.
Yeah, it's